working group. This is our final episode of the year. That first link right there is what you can share with friends next year so they can sign up and get the Monday blasts with a preview of the coming guests. And below that is the, it's the collection of our old videos at the Brighteon site. You can see going back a whole year how many great videos we have, including there in the middle, Skip Estes from Alec did a similar topic to Paul's on rich states, poor states. And after a week or so, we'll have Paul's video up there that you can promote and share around and give us some likes and views. And just to introduce Paul, but first, this is sponsored by Your Freedom Hub Working Group and the Your Freedom Hub, which unites freedom activists and entrepreneurial disruptors for a better world. We do have currently a health promotion going on for those of you who know friends or small business heads who are looking for a better healthcare solution. And if so, just connect them to me and I'll make sure they cut their insurance costs in half and get a health savings account for retirement and become a cash payer. So Paul Gessing is a longtime friend. We knew each other back in DC when he was the government affairs director for the National Taxpayers Union. And as a side gig, he was working with me, helping out a friend with this little rag called Free Liberal. He grew up and got a really nice gig running the think tank for a whole state, New Mexico, the Rio Grande Foundation, almost 15 years ago. And since then, he has really built a nice website that I hope folks check out, riograndefoundation.org. He gets in the media because there's not much republicanism out in New Mexico, pretty blue state. Mm-hmm. It's a pretty state, and it's a blue state is in Democrat control, although they have occasionally Republican governors and the like. So we're excited to hear from Paul.
So thanks, Charlie. And today I'm going to be talking about a case, but a specific case for limited government and limiting government. I'm going to use New Mexico and Colorado as really the case study here, providing some detailed data showing how one state, Colorado, with a relatively strict, well, actually the strictest limit on government and growth of government in the entire country, the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights, and New Mexico, a state that has no restrictions on government spending. And real quickly, before I jump into things, Colorado back on election day, so this year, the voters in that state rejected an effort to allow the government of Colorado, and that's government, I guess governments, because Taxpayers' Bill of Rights applies to the state, but it also applies to local governments as well. And the idea was that they would allow the government to take any money that was brought in taxes above and beyond inflation and population growth. Taxpayers' Bill of Rights limits the growth of government and governments to the combined rate of inflation and population growth. So it essentially freezes the size of government in amber. You can argue that it ultimately is shrinking government, or you can argue that it's allowing government to expand slightly, but do so by becoming more efficient. Either way, it is by far the most restrictive approach to government spending in the entire country. And I'll share some data on that. Let me see here. Whoop. Charlie, how do I page down? I'm trying to get down. Let's see.
Yeah, sometimes.
Oh, there we go. I got it. Okay, you have to click the button. So real quick before I jump into the presentation, this is about the Rio Grande Foundation. We're nonpartisan, we're free market, we make no bones about that. And we work in New Mexico, which is a blue state. as Charlie mentioned, we're like Colorado in that regard. This is the map from the last presidential election, by the way. You see, I think it's pretty intuitive to most people, but the West Coast is pretty blue. Nevada is a relatively recent addition to the blue states. The East Coast, kind of that Boss Wash corridor up to Maine and New England. And then really, Colorado, New Mexico, Minnesota, Illinois are pretty unique in their being in the middle of the country, not on a coast, and blue though. And so I'm really focusing in though on New Mexico and Colorado here in this presentation and their comparisons. For starters, both Colorado and New Mexico are big oil producing states. Now, they do produce natural resources across the spectrum, a lot of mining historically in both places, and continuing to this day. New Mexico has recently rocketed up to be the third leading producer of oil in the entire country. This is, of course, from the Energy Information Agency, so the federal government that tracks these issues. Texas is the largest. North Dakota has kind of rocketed up in recent years, Oklahoma, Colorado. So that's who produces oil in the various states. And in that regard, New Mexico and Colorado are fairly similar. From the looks of these pictures, and maybe someone who's traveled to both places can figure out which of those mountain vistas is from New Mexico, which is from Colorado. I'll break the tie. It's New Mexico is the lower left. Those are the Sandias in Albuquerque. The top right is Colorado. I put a river, dried up riverbed there to indicate that in addition to the stunning mountain vistas and wide open spaces in both states, neither state has really navigable waterways. It's something that a lot of people in New Mexico claim is, the big hindrance to economic growth and prosperity is, well, we don't have the traditional waterways that you get on the Mississippi River system. You don't have those opportunities to ship material and whatnot across the water. Well, as you'll see shortly, that is not a hindrance to the state of Colorado. Overall, it's really economic freedom that separates New Mexico out. And of course, keeping your own money, having low taxes, low government spending is a core component of economic freedom. This is a report that I highly recommend anybody who's involved in state level policy or politics look at. The Economic Freedom of North America Index. The Fraser Institute is a Canadian think tank. They actually look at Canadian provinces. They look at U.S. states. They look at Mexican countries or territories as well. The red is the least free quadrant, the quartile, and the orangish is the second to least, so the greenish is the second most free, and the blue states are the freest. So you can see just from looking at this that New Mexico is a bastion of relative economic unfreedom within a very competitive, economically free region. We're bordered, except for Utah, by states that are in that top quadrant of economic freedom, and New Mexico is in the bottom. And so I have my work cut out for me at the Rio Grande Foundation, trying to bring more economic freedom to an unfree state. Federation of Tax Administrators, total taxes as a percentage of personal income. New Mexico is pretty close to the top, but blue Colorado is a state that's really near the bottom. You don't think of Texas and Colorado in the same breath, but the Colorado Taxpayer Bill of Rights, despite that blue state label, they are a relatively fiscally conservative state. And even within the region, reddish states like Arizona and Utah and Oklahoma are a little higher in the tax department than Colorado. And then on spending, it's not a surprise that when you tax more, you spend more. In New Mexico, state and local spending is really out of whack when it comes to the region that we are in. You can see that our state government is bigger as a percentage of our economy than both state and local spending in Colorado. And then you throw local spending on the top of that, New Mexico really comes unglued. It's astonishing how big our government is. So you see those comparisons from state to state. And so let me share briefly about that comparison of the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights in Colorado versus the unrestricted spending in New Mexico. And we went and looked. Taxpayer Bill of Rights, by the way, in Colorado came out in 1992. It was enacted by a citizen initiative. It actually was the proving of the motto that the third time is a charm. A gentleman named Douglas Bruce in Colorado, a taxpayer activist, kind of a all-around curmudgeon and pain in the you-know-what to a lot of folks on both sides of the aisle in Colorado, was really the personality that got that done in that state. Of course, the voters had to vote it in, and since then, as you can see, the split between per capita personal income in Colorado and New Mexico has grown rather broad. In fact, 32% faster growth in Colorado in terms of personal income relative to New Mexico. And we looked at it in prior years, and the split was not nearly so pronounced between Colorado and New Mexico. Yes, Colorado's always been a little more prosperous economically than New Mexico, but we've seen the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights really drive a major wedge in terms of the differences of the two economies. And people vote with their feet. And I like to say that New Mexico is the ideal state in many ways when it comes to weather. We have the 4 seasons, but it's dry. You have a lot of sunshine, over 300 days a year. We're located in the area of the country where growth is really happening. People want to be in the Mountain West states, and they're moving to Colorado. And that difference has grown quite pronounced since 1992, when the Taxpayer Bill of Rights came along. 121% growth in terms of how much Colorado's exceeded New Mexico. And then we went back and looked at the pre-Tabor period. We just picked a date, 1950, I think is a reasonable time. You could go back further, you could go back less far, but 1950 is kind of a round number, 42 years. And the growth difference between Colorado and New Mexico was just 28.5%. What's driving this? Well, you can make all kinds of assumptions and statements, and you could say, well, it's some other factor. Certainly the rush to the Sun Belt, if you will, has grown as people have gotten more mobile. People are able to move, but in all honesty, in recent years, population's grown somewhat more reticent to move. So I just think it's an obvious indicator that especially the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights has created a big, pronounced difference between the two states. I'm not saying, by the way, that every state can or should adopt the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights. I don't think it's possible, really. You have to really have the initiative process. A politician voting for Tabor is like a chicken voting for Colonel Sanders. They don't want to spend less money. This is just a regional comparison. Yes, other states have also grown faster as well. And New Mexico right now, we're in the midst of an unprecedented oil boom. So right now we have incredible amounts of money coming in to the state thanks to the oil boom. We actually have, over the last 2 years, gone from a $6.3 billion general fund to a $7.88 billion general fund. And one of the reasons that we've been researching this at the Rio Grande Foundation is that while we don't expect the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights to come into play, we don't have the initiative process in New Mexico. We want to make it clear to policymakers and citizens that simply spending more money, growing government is not going to be beneficial to the long-term prospects of the state of New Mexico. So we have this money coming in, and we would like to see some of it returned to the taxpayers, some tax reforms made, even if it's revenue neutral, just to get our tax code to work better. I could explain some of those in the Q&A, but New Mexico really needs to use this unprecedented oil boom money wisely, or we're going to be a state that's always been, as we have, 49th or 50th in almost all measurements, academic, economic, etc. And we're going to be continuing at the bottom of that pile. And that's kind of our work for us in the state of New Mexico. So we've come up with a series of graphics. Every man, woman, and child in the state, if we returned that largesse, factoring in inflation and population growth, we could see this kind of money returned to the taxpayers, $786 for every man, woman, and child in the state. That's $3,655 for a family of 5, which just so happens to be the size of the Gessing family. And that's a pretty incredible figure when you get down to it, the amount of money that we could see returned to us, capital back in private hands, instead of being blown on government largesse, more government hiring, government bureaucrats, et cetera, et cetera. I guess I'll conclude my presentation, and maybe I'm shorter than I needed to be, but I have said basically what I have to say. If you want to follow what's going on in New Mexico, I first and foremost encourage you to check out our podcast. We do 2 episodes a week. It's a great way, I think, if your organization is in the public policy sphere, to kind of connect with new people in different groups that you want to find out more about, want to get engaged with. So that's your organizational benefit. Of course, you spread the word about what you're doing as an organization as well to podcasts are not like radio shows. Podcasts are listened to all the way through. People who tend to be more engaged and more interested in what's going on. And I think that our podcast has really helped benefit the organization from that perspective, as well as engaging with new different people. So you can find out more about that. Tipping Point New Mexico. We're on the Apple, the iTunes, the Stitcher, and all the different platforms. And of course, you can follow me on Twitter at @pguessing. Just don't put a U in my last name, or you won't get me. And you can find our website, et cetera, right there. So with that, it's a short but sweet explanation of what Colorado's got going for it, while New Mexico and many other states that kind of just spend unlimited quantities of money as they come through the door is dealing with.
Oh, thanks, Paul. That was great. Folks, if you want to raise your hand, there's an icon. Just click the raise hand icon, you'll see it, and I'll call on you. And David Demarest, I see you have your hand up, and I think that you have yourself muted.
Thank you, Charlie.
Go ahead.
Paul, this is David Demarest with Roads to Freedom Foundation. We're based in Omaha. Paul, do you expect the political initiatives that you're involved in to be successful in New Mexico? And if not, how do you think the private sector could weigh in and help solve these problems in New Mexico?
So thank you for that question. New Mexico has historically been reliant on federal spending the labs, military installations, etc., and oil and gas. Now we have this unique opportunity with the oil and gas money to do something positive to change the way our economy works, and do so in a fundamental way. Now, we had a very difficult, challenging legislative session in 2019 from our perspective. We had 8 years of Governor Martinez, Susana Martinez, a pretty conservative Republican who was ranked very highly by Cato for keeping a lid on spending. And the Democrats came in, a pretty progressive crew, and really passed 8 years worth of pent up bad legislation in 1 year. Now the party is in some way over. They want to get reelected in 2020, and they've got this money coming in, and our whole conversation that we're having is trying to create a constituency for reform and say, look, this state has a real opportunity to change itself for the better and actually enact policies that it's not going to have an easy time doing in the future if we don't take advantage of this oil boom right now. So I'm actually optimistic about the 2020 session, which gets rolling here in mid-January. We have good conversations going on both public employee pensions and reforming those in a way. We've worked with the Reason Foundation, and Lynn Gilroy is the expert that we've worked with on that. And he's said, yeah, this is a good start. And also we have this weird system, and I could probably someday give a presentation on this forum about the gross receipts tax and why gross receipts taxes are really evil. New Mexico has a gross receipts tax that, unlike most where they're really low rate, like a 0.25 or something %, our gross receipts tax is in many ways like a sales tax. So when you go to the store and buy something, they charge you in Albuquerque at 7.875%, but it's actually a gross receipts tax. So when somebody who's a contractor, so if the Rio Grande Foundation, which is a small organization, we hire somebody to do our books, to run our website, they have to tack on a tax of 7.875 on the top of their bill for the Rio Grande Foundation. And that is very unattractive for small businesses on either side of the equation, the contractor or the contractee. And we actually are hopeful in that we're going to get some gross receipts tax reform this session. So those are pretty good if we can get that done. There's other reforms that need to happen in New Mexico, but we're coming out of a period where we had relative conservative rule, and we're back in a progressive paradigm. And at some point, we need to get back to a place where we have enough conservative power to pass things like right to work and reforms like school choice. Those two issues have been discussed and attempted on various occasions, but we've never gotten them done in the legislature.
Paul, Charlie here. I got a few questions, and if Pranav and John want to raise their hand, I'd be interested to hear their take on state advocacy in their states, especially Pranav with DC and Maryland being probably more blue than New Mexico, maybe Maryland's similar, pretty solid blue state. And then John, Pennsylvania, that's I guess, what do you call Pennsylvania, a red state? Or it's right on the margins there. But let's go into tax reforms. You said you would explain it a bit more. You mentioned the gross receipts tax. What are some of your more ideal reforms? I mean, are we trying as libertarians to go more in a consumption tax mode, or is it something more smaller and humble because of your situation, such as Democrat majority?
Yeah, at this point in New Mexico, we're really totally focused on the gross receipts tax and removing some of the worst problems with that. The gross receipts tax, and any gross receipts tax has this problem Unfortunately, this is not going to be addressed in this coming legislative session, but you get a system of tax pyramiding, and that's where you have a good or service that's bought by another provider in the production chain, and so you have taxes charged on top of taxes, whereas a straight sales tax is just done at the point of sale. One aspect of that would be, New Mexico's got this oil boom going. And so if you put a drilling rig in the Permian Basin, which is going on all the time, the people selling the drilling rig, they have to charge the gross receipts tax to put that drilling rig in the ground. And that creates a heavy tax burden. That's just one of many examples that the gross receipts tax causes. So I would first put a cautionary tale out there that gross receipts taxes are really, really awful when it comes to economic incentives. Now, New Mexico is not too far out of line when you look at our neighbors, Texas being the exception. Texas has very no income tax and relatively high property taxes. Now, Arizona, Utah, Colorado have similar income taxes to New Mexico. They also have low property taxes, and they have sales tax rates that are similar to our gross receipts. So if you look just at taxes, we're not too far off from some of those states. Now, if I was in one of those states, I would push for more of a Texas style approach. I think Texas has proven itself to be an economic juggernaut through thick and thin times nationwide. So having the focus on eliminating income tax, because people don't always want to work. To put in disincentives in the way of productive activity, work, through an income tax is just a dumb thing for government to do. Property taxes, while people don't like them, that's actually a benefit of the property tax, is that you create a visible, transparent tax on wealth that people have a very strong interest in keeping a lid on the amount of taxes paid. They see it, they don't like it, and it helps prevent overreach in that area of taxation. So if I had, big picture, long term, New Mexico could look at Texas as a model for tax policy. And I'd say that's your model for a lot of states, is if you can do it. But yeah, we're a long way from that in New Mexico.
And if folks want to press the raise hand button or just blurt out a question, go ahead and unmute yourself. I'll just keep asking some questions here. What about Martinez? You mentioned her high rating from Cato, and before her, we had Bill Clinton's friend there,
Richardson.
Bill Richardson, and before that we had Gary Johnson. So my question is, to what extent did at least Martinez and Gary Johnson offset this kind of muzzling effect that the Democrat majorities have had on the state's growth and that kind of thing?
Well, I'll work forward. Gary, personal friend of, I think, both of ours. Charlie, somebody who we really admire a lot. I could share data showing that while Gary did a great job of vetoing a lot of bills from a very liberal, progressive legislature, he did, and I think Gary himself would recognize this, he got snookered a bit early on. He was trying to work a deal where he got school choice vouchers through the legislature while also passing a lot of money in the way of new education spending for in kind of exchange, quid pro quo, if you will, to use a term of art of the day. And unfortunately, the quid pro quo fell apart. Gary never got the school choice, but of course the spending was eaten up by the system, and really no significant reforms happened. And Gary was working with the Democrat legislature that was hostile to any educational reform and school choice. And we're a state that performs right at the very bottom in educational outcomes. And so Gary was definitely fighting a good fight, but he wasn't, if you look at the data, as fiscally conservative as Susana Martinez wound up being. Now, Susana was in a very tough economic time for New Mexico. Prices in the oil patch tended to be down. We were coming out of the financial crisis of 2008. So there was a lot of headwinds for Martinez, but she did keep a lid on spending, I think, to an even greater extent than than Johnson. Now Richardson followed Johnson, I'm sorry. He was a Democrat, more of the Clinton style, new Democrat. Bill Richardson, most people would argue that he was a very corrupt governor, and that's ultimately what cost him a post with the Obama administration, is some issues that he had ethically that caused the Obama people to back off on, I believe it was Commerce Secretary, something, some cabinet position with the Obama administration. Richardson, though, was conservative as a Democrat goes, especially by today's standards in New Mexico. He was pro-gun, which is not something that most Democrats in New Mexico are these days. He actually cut income taxes. We had a top rate of 8.2, and as I said, now it was 4.9. It's much more in line with states around us. Richardson did a few things that have caused real problems for the state economically. He built a spaceport that still hasn't been effectively utilized. Richard Branson's going to launch private space trips any day now, but in the meantime, it's a huge white elephant out of there, and I'm kind of being facetious. We have no idea when Richard Branson's going to start launching people into space, but someday, at some point. The Rail Runner, a commuter train that, while all commuter trains are very expensive and lose gobs of money in operations, and the capital outlay is never recouped. If you've been to New Mexico, it's a pretty sparsely populated area, and commuter rail needs one thing and one thing only, and that's a lot of people traveling around, and it never made sense. It's a waste of money. But with Martinez, for 8 years in office, she never came after the Rail Runner, and I suspect that it's going to continue to chug down the tracks, burning up taxpayer cash every single year. About $30 million in taxpayer subsidies between the state and federal governments, and that's just in operations, not even talking about the capital outlay. So Richardson put some tough obstacles in front of Martinez. Martinez, not so libertarian as Gary Johnson, definitely a spending hawk. Times were bad. She comes from a law enforcement background, not as willing to try to legalize drugs or something. In fact, she tried to go the opposite direction. I would overall say Martinez was a very solid governor, certainly fiscal conservative. For 2 years, 2 glorious years, she had a Republican House and really attempted to push some reforms, but the Senate was controlled by a very liberal opponent and managed to stop any reform that came out of the House from making its way into law. We pushed right to work at that time. We pushed for some school choice initiatives at that time. There was a lot of effort to enact some economic reforms, but they really never had the support in that last legislative body in the Senate, and it was tough. So, I'm much more familiar with the Martinez years and to an extent the Richardson years, but Martinez, her big accomplishment from a libertarian perspective, ironically, was in 2015, New Mexico became the national leader on civil asset forfeiture, which is ironic for kind of a prosecutor, drug warrior type Republican, but we had some pieces fall together in the right place, and in 2015, the House and Senate in New Mexico on a unanimous basis passed civil asset forfeiture reform, and New Mexico, the governor signed it. It was, I think, a hard call for her. She wound up signing it. and New Mexico became a national leader on civil asset forfeiture reform, and the Rio Grande Foundation was part of that coalition. So we've had some nice victories on issues like that. Richardson got eminent domain reform done in New Mexico, so we've done some good stuff on constitutional protections and whatnot. But when it comes to the nuts and bolts economic reform, it's really not been fertile territory for any of that, anything that's going to contribute to your economic growth.
Now, did Martinez really get your state going towards Colorado, or despite her fiscal hucktum, were things still kind of chugging along barely, or have things gotten worse since Martinez?
Well, the spending came after Martinez.
How long ago was Martinez?
So she left office in, so this is 2019. So she left office at the end of 2018.
Okay.
So we've only had one legislative session with the new governor, but that's when the money from oil and gas really started to flow in. And I really should say oil. Natural gas prices remain depressed, but oil prices and production have really remained strong and been that boost for New Mexico's economy. So it really happened after Martinez's last budget. So her last budget was, of course, passed in March of 2018, and the oil boom in New Mexico really was just getting kicked off. So between the new governor and the new legislative leadership and the oil boom taking off in New Mexico, that's really where the spending has gotten completely out of control. They had a 12% spending increase last year. We're expecting probably a close to double-digit increase this year, thanks to all the money flowing in here. Including free college. Free college is one of the latest proposals coming from the Lujan Grisham administration, and yeah, it's all kinds of just a grab bag of new government programs and spending. And for example, K-12 education spending went up 16% last year under the Lujan Grisham, new liberal group that came in. Our education system is not great, but we actually spend more per pupil than any of our neighbors who blow us out of the water on results. So yeah, it's a challenge. It is a real challenging state, and we've got so many opportunities, so much potential. But until we get the politicians to, actually value becoming an economic growth state and competing with our neighbors, we're going to kind of struggle, especially relative to places like Colorado. But that's the situation I'm dealing with.
David, I see your hand up, and go ahead.
Paul, do you think that the oil money boom might actually camouflage New Mexico's other serious problems? And if so, what other area could you look to in the private sector to help support the political efforts to turn things around?
So I agree that the oil boom is masking problems elsewhere in the economy and just the whole social order in New Mexico. I'll go into the private sector thing. So I'm a true libertarian when it comes to private sector growth. I don't have a particular industry or group of industries that I think should come to New Mexico or that I have on a list. I think, given New Mexico's location, the climate, and many advantages that we have, the traffic's not nearly as bad as, say, Denver, or it's relatively easy to get around, and the quality of life is good, et cetera, et cetera. We don't have a real robust private sector in New Mexico. We don't have any Fortune 500 companies headquartered in the state. There's only a handful of publicly traded companies headquartered in the state, including P&M, the utility, which is barely a private company. We have some interesting startups and whatnot that are located here. There's a company that's using technology out of Los Alamos Labs. Mark Johnson's the guy's name, and it's called Descartes Labs, based in Santa Fe. And Mark's actually a libertarian and real forward-thinking guy. They use satellite data to help companies track megatrends in various markets. So like the corn farmers and corn industry, they can figure out what the price is going to be using their data, that kind of thing. So there's some people doing some interesting things, but what tends to happen is that you have a really neat project or product, and then somebody from another state comes along and buys it, and chances are they move a lot of their operations out of state. So we just got to keep get a better soil, if you will. We've got to change the soil of New Mexico to make it a more hospitable place for a lot more of these businesses to get started, and then hopefully they have so much success that they stay here instead of going to other locales. But it's hard for a lot of them to, I think, justify sticking around if they do make it. And we don't have as many companies as we'd like to in New Mexico to just stick around and be that new publicly traded Fortune 500 style company. So that's what we're really focused on, is changing those basic policies to try to clear the way for more private sector growth. But I couldn't point to one or two private companies that I see as being true partners moving forward. The oil and gas industry, as you might imagine, is inclined towards free market positions, mostly from a defensive posture. They're trying to push back against the tidal wave of green regulations and kind of that whole effort to stifle processes like fracking and put carbon caps in and those kinds of things. But I wouldn't say there's like one or two private sector leaders. The startups are in startup phase. They don't have time for politics. They're focused on growing their business and keeping the doors open.
Paul, one final question from my end, and if others have questions, just click that raise hand icon and we'll get Paul's take. Immigration. I know here in Virginia, a lot of folks are a little concerned about the Democrat wave that just took over our state, and some of the Tea Party types are worried that immigration is inflating Democrat votes. You mentioned Martinez as a governor. She's a Republican, so I don't think ethnicity necessarily translates to votes for the party that supports bigger government. And of course, you have that border there with Mexico where Trump is trying to build that wall. What are some of your thoughts on immigration in your state?
Well, there's a couple things. One is my organization does not work directly on immigration reform one way or the other. Philosophically, we're for a process of getting immigrants here, processing them, and helping them become American citizens and get jobs and all that kind of stuff. So that's just our philosophical outlook. Now, New Mexico as a state, it's worth noting that unlike a lot of states in this region, the Hispanic population is by and large not immigrant. Susana Martinez, for example, and many of our political leaders, of course, Bill Richardson famously had half Mexican background. The border crossed them. We're much more of a border crossed us kind of state than a fresh immigrant experience type state. And that's a different experience, a different philosophical outlook, and it's really, they don't see each other as part of the same group at all. In fact, some of the most anti-immigrant people you could want to meet are old home New Mexicans who have been in the country, or Americans for, since America took over from Mexico, and they really resent being lumped in with the more fresh immigrants. And so it's a weird political dynamic. It's just a very real dynamic that you become aware of when you live and see day-to-day experience. But in New Mexico, like I said, because of our economic, dysfunction, is really not a state that's seen as much immigration into it as a lot of other states. And that's immigration from other states as well as immigration from other countries. In fact, our young people are generally leaving the state of New Mexico. So, it's not as big of a political issue here in New Mexico because people know the dynamic is much different. But I think that Martinez, for example, when she was governor, she had a more nuanced position on immigration than President Trump currently does. And I think Arizona has historically had a much more hawkish position. Joe Arpaio, those kinds of folks. That doesn't fly in New Mexico. We have too many. It's too much of a more blue state. It's too Hispanic ethnically. They don't take that hard line publicly. They might have a hard line privately, but it's a really unique perspective out here in the Mountain West in New Mexico when it comes to immigration.
Well, thanks very much, Paul. That was a great presentation. Does anyone have a final question? Just unmute yourself and blurt it out.
So, Paul, how about fertilizing the soil with a cash basis healthcare initiative? For example, like the cash basis Oklahoma City Surgical Center. How about a Albuquerque or Santa Fe cash basis surgical center, or possibly leveraging the homeschooling movement for some type of cash basis education movement?
So I haven't talked to people about the Oklahoma style healthcare thing. We have our podcast, and I've had a few conversations with direct primary care physicians. I don't know what opportunities there are out there for that. One of the groups that I think could really do some interesting things in a policy environment is the Native American population, because they're exempted from so much federal regulation that they could have some fun experiments out there on the tribal lands. But cracking into those groups is very, very difficult. A lot of suspicion if you're an Anglo outsider, et cetera. In terms of the homeschool, that is definitely a good idea. Homeschool people, in my experience, they're very, they want to stay outside the political process as much as possible. If they're kind of like the porcupine that the libertarians use as their motto. They don't do much day to day as an organized group, but they try. If you threaten them, they will strike back fiercely. And so far, we haven't necessarily tried a great deal of inroads with the homeschool community, but that's a group that, you're right, would be a good area to find potential allies. So I appreciate that comment.
So, Paul, I want to close and just remind folks again how to reach you.
They can find me on Twitter at @pgessing, no U in guessing. They can go to our website, riograndefoundation.org. And if they want to call me on the phone, 505-264-6090.
That's great, Paul.
Thanks, Charlie.